So this is quite an influential paper because it was one of the first attempts to actually make a very thorough description on how all of these different visual areas are linked together with each other. So it's based on database material. So they have mapped out in the macaque brain all of the different visual areas. Each of them have certain properties. So some are, for instance, as I said, responsible for color vision, some for motion perception. And then they have made a list of how these areas are connected with each other, which directions these areas are, or how these areas project to each other. So, and what they found out, which is probably the most influential part of this work here, is that there is what they call a hierarchical organization of all these visual areas, which means that the lower primary visual areas, well, they serve as the ground for the next visual areas, and on top of them we have the more specialized visual areas which then use the information that is in the lower visual areas. So there is this hierarchy where the primary functions, for instance, direction selectivity is represented in the primary V1 and also to some extent in V2, whereas then the information that the first visual areas can process is then used in the higher order visual areas. And that's what made up this hierarchy. So the higher up you get, well, the idea is that the more specialized and the more dependent on previous functions these areas are. And because this is done in the visual cortex, it has been, well, the visual cortex is very much devoted to receiving sensory signals from the external world and then use them in a way, for instance, to guide our movements so we can reach for something. However, there is also a lot of reciprocal connections in this map here. So it's also found that some of these areas actually project back again to the lower visual area. So for instance, you can actually see that if you have a task where you attend to a certain part of the visual field. So for instance, you direct your sight towards a specific part of the visual field. Well, then you can actually see that this attention can actually modulate activity in lower, for instance, area V2, which is not just receiving information, but actually some kind of willed action that you want to direct your attention towards something can actually modulate activity in these lower order visual areas. So it's not strictly, I mean, there is also something that can go down again, but the idea with this hierarchy is that the lower functions, they are sort of the building blocks for the higher functions. This is, yeah, if you go through this paper, it's very long and it's a lot of tables, and it's not very interesting actually to look at, but this graph here has had a huge influence on the way that we understand the brain today. So, and how the visual system works, at least in the macaque, and then this has also been taken up to humans, and it's believed that there are similar functions. What you will notice is, for instance, that this is primarily a visual map, so there is very little attention drawn towards some of the motor areas. So there is the frontal eye field, which is linked to eye movements, but that's sort of what there is in this map. So, so some of the primary motor areas, for instance, are not included.